Good evening, welcome all of you. Buenas tardes, bienvenidos a todos. Dr. Richard Haass, President of Council on Foreign Relations. First of all, thank you for being here as President of CARI, but in representation of all our members, I want to express the great honor for all of us to host you today. At the same time, congratulations for the 100th century of Council on Foreign Relations. We're expecting for another century more. We are really very proud to participate as a member of the Council of Councils. And we recognize your inspiration, commitment, and leadership. Your remarks today, the word after 9/11, is an opportunity to express again and again our condemn to the barbarian terrorist attacks and our solidarity with the United States of America, with the victims and their families. Among them were Argentines working in the Twin Towers or participating as public services in the dangerous and dramatic rescue. Looking to the past and the future, you said not long ago, I believe in a conversation with some American journalists, I lament, you say, the bipartisan turn away from the mostly internationalist spirit that has informed us foreign policies, US foreign policies, since the end of the World War II. We are very glad, very happy, finally, at the CARI's house, as you can see, Mr. President. With me is your good friend, Adalberto Rodriguez Javarini, our former president of CARI, is Carola Ramona Vergano, our member of the executive committee, and our General Secretary, Ambassador Ricardo Lagorio, that he will have the responsibility and the honor to introduce you and to coordinate the discussion, or more the dialogue that we will have today. Dr. Haass, dear friend, we wait with regard, respect, and estimation your knowledgeable words. Thank you so much. Ambassador Lagorio.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bordon. Good afternoon, Dr. Haass. A pleasure meeting you. I will not try to do impossible mission, which is to refer to your bio. It's impossible. But I would just stress that you are in a very unique position to address what we are going to listen from you, which is the evolution of US foreign policy since 9/11. You are definitely, Dr. Haass, one of the most influential voices, not only in US foreign policy, but regarding global matters. And you have also the perfect perspective because you are a seasonable diplomat. I had the honor and pleasure of working with you when I was posted in Washington from 2000 to 2003, and then you are a leading scholar. So, Dr. Haass, it's a great pleasure, and looking forward listening to you and then have a very constructive dialogue, not only regarding the past, but mainly regarding this very interesting future ahead of us. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, sir, Ambassador Ligorio, and Jose Octavio, thank you. Great to see my friend of many, many years, Alberto. I'm sorry only we're doing it virtually, so you still have to buy me a drink the next time I come to your country. It's good to be with Kari. It's an important institution. We are very pleased, to say the least, that you are partners of ours in the Council of Councils enterprise. So thank you very much for both your generous words and doing me the honor of speaking with you today. I was saying just before that I will not do my American impersonation of Mr. Castro. I will not speak for several hours. I will speak for just a few minutes. I'd much prefer a conversation, a dialogue, because there's so much experience around the table here. You asked me to speak about the legacy of 9/11, which is essentially the world of the last 2 decades. It's an interesting question. Obviously, I've been thinking about it also because we just marked the 20th anniversary of that terrible day. Nearly 3,000 people, innocent people, lost their lives, mostly from my country, but also from yours and dozens of other countries. It was another example of the indiscriminate nature at times of terrorism. As bad as it was, though, and it was truly awful, what's so interesting in retrospect is what it didn't do. And it was not the beginning of an era of history that was defined by terrorism. If you think about it, thank God, terrorism has not defined, for the most part, the last 20 years. Lots of reasons why. In many ways, 9/11, what happened, it improved the capabilities of many countries to counter terrorism. We put more resources into intelligence. We created new institutions in the United States. We improved the coordination of these institutions inside the US government, inside the federal government, between the federal government and the states. We much improve intelligence sharing and cooperation across the world. So essentially the world reacted to 9/11 and improved its ability to detect and protect against attacks before they would happen again. I also think that 9/11 strengthened the idea, what in foreign policy we would call norms, that there was no distinction between terrorists and governments that provided sanctuary to terrorists. And there's not a lot of agreement in this world when one looks at all the divisions in our world. But there's a considerable agreement about opposition to terrorism. You don't hear a lot anymore what we used to hear 40 or 50 years ago, that one man's terrorism is another man's freedom fighter. I think now, after 9/11, there's much, it's not universal, but there's more of a consensus that terrorism is simply an unacceptable method to advance a political agenda. I also think that terrorism has not defined the world because so much of it has been in one part of the world, the Middle East and South Asia. It's been more of a regional reality than it has been a global reality. And when the United States went into Afghanistan 20 years ago, after 9/11, removed the Taliban government, Afghanistan, for most of these 20 years, ceased to be a sanctuary for terrorism. So for any number of reasons, I think the good news is that over the last 20 years, the world has made a lot of progress against terrorism. That said, at the end of World War II, there was an important ceremony on the battleship Missouri when there was the surrender the Japan to the United States, or at the end of our Civil War in the mid-19th century, there was the scene where the Confederacy, the Southern states, surrendered to the Union at Appomattox. Well, there's nothing like this in the war on terrorism. This is a war without end. It continues, and my guess is it will always continue, because there will always be people prepared to kill, and there will always be people prepared to die for their cause. And so to me, the definition of success is not the elimination of terrorism. It's not the end of the war on terrorism, but rather it's the reduction of the war on terrorism so that most of us can live our lives normally and safely. That if we take reasonable precautions, our economies can prosper, we can go about our lives safely. Essentially, the terrorists, that we deny the terrorists the ability to so fundamentally change our lives or to give up our freedoms. But we also have to understand that this is an open-ended struggle. I should probably say also that I don't much like the phrase war on terrorism. That it suggests, the word war suggests that the instruments are military. Well, yes, there are at times military instruments, but some of the most important instruments to be used in the war on terrorism are anything but military. Education can be an important tool in the effort. Intelligence is obviously an important tool. Police have an important role to play. Diplomacy can have a role. So I think it's important not to over-militarize this. Yes, sometimes the use of military force will be essential, but we need to approach this with all the instruments of national security, much like anything else. I think in some ways, one of the principal consequences of what became known as the global war on terrorism, how would you say that? La guerra mundial contra terrorismo, was on the United States. And it was not because of our initial reaction in Afghanistan. I was heavily involved with this. After 9/11, I was asked by President Bush, President George W. Bush, to coordinate U.S. policy towards Afghanistan. But it's what came to pass over the years. The United States got much more ambitious in Afghanistan. And obviously, a year and a half, 18 months after 9/11, the United States launched the war in Iraq. Both of these wars turned out to be extraordinarily expensive in terms of lives lost, in terms of dollars spent. And in Afghanistan, after 20 years, to be honest, we have very little, if anything, to show for it. The Taliban are back in power. And in Iraq, there has been some progress in Iraq, but I think it's a fair question to ask whether it was worth it, whether whatever progress there's been in Iraq justify the costs. And I think a lot of people would have their doubts, shall we say, that that's the case. And I think one of the major consequences of the war on terrorism is the results of the American response to it. And it's the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq in particular turned out to be, as I said, very costly by every measure. They turned out to be strategic distractions. They, Alberto and others have, ambassadors, all of you have experience in government. One of the most precious resources in government is time and energy. And these wars absorb an enormous amount of time and energy on the part of policymakers. What it also did is it distracted us as a result from other things we might have done in the world, in part because of the resources, but again, because of the time, the things we didn't do in other parts of the world. And then domestically, I actually believe the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, how would I put it? The global war on terrorism had a greater impact on American public opinion than the terrorists. The global war on terrorism has created considerable doubts about the wisdom of the United States carrying out a global foreign policy. It's strengthened elements of isolationism in the country. And the lack of success in Afghanistan and Iraq has reinforced populism in the United States. It's reinforced doubts about the judgment of elites. These doubts were further reinforced by the financial crisis in 2007-8. There's many reasons. But when you look at the loss of faith of many Americans in their government, a lot of it has to do with what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan, particularly when in Iraq, weapons of mass destruction were never located. After that was articulated as a major rationale for the war. So I understand that, again, nearly 3,000 people died in a day 20 years ago. The United States made all sorts of organizational and bureaucratic and procedural changes, from including how we, the security before we get on airplanes. We've spent billions and billions of dollars to make ourselves less vulnerable. I think it's worked very well. But I think, the biggest result of 9/11 is not what happened on 9/11, but it's what happened in the 20 years since because of the policy responses to 9/11. So, and I'll finish up here. So here we are today in a world that is not defined by terrorism, thank God. Though I do fear that we could see something of a resurgence of terrorism. I think what happened in Afghanistan in the last few weeks and months has once again made Afghanistan a place where terrorists will operate from. And I also believe it has given a shot of adrenaline to terrorists. It's given them greater sense of possibility and optimism. But what I would say about the world more broadly is three things, and then I'll stop. One is that this is a world not defined by terrorism, but it is increasingly defined by other global issues. One is what is the issue associated with COP26 and the meetings in Glasgow, climate change, issues associated with the COVID pandemic, COVID-19. But these are all global challenges. And terrorism is one global challenge, but in some ways, these other global challenges have so far, particularly climate change and public health, have proven to be even more significant global challenges. But what they have in common is none of them respect borders. We're all, to one degree or another, vulnerable. Secondly, this is a world increasingly defined, once again, by great power rivalry. It's been 2 decades since 9/11. It's been 3 decades since the end of the Cold War. But here we are, 20 years after 9/11, 32 years after the Berlin Wall came down. And U.S.-Russian relations are in very poor condition, to say the least, and U.S.-Chinese relations are getting worse. So one could say we had one Cold War for 40 years, and now we are close to what you might describe as two contemporary, if not exactly Cold Wars, very, very problematic relations among three of the great powers or major powers of the day. And thirdly, all this is taking place, these global challenges, this revival of great power rivalry at a time, in part because of what happened after 9/11, the United States is more divided and less certain about its role in the world. So we have this reality where you have global challenges stemming from including climate and other issues. You've got great power rivalry, but there's less consensus in the United States than we've gotten used to about what to do about them. And the United States is also, at the moment, many Americans are more concerned with domestic issues than they are with global issues. And so this, I believe, adds up to a very difficult moment in history. Not so much because of terrorism, though, again, one always has to be careful and be vigilant, but more in some ways because of what's happened in the 20 years since 9/11 and 30 years since the end of the Cold War. So the good news is our world is not defined by terrorism. The bad news, though, is our world is increasingly defined by growing great power rivalry, an enormous gap between global challenges and global responses, and increasingly by the United States that is somewhat uncertain as to what role it is prepared to play in the world. So why don't I stop there? I don't mean to be pessimistic. I suppose the good news is that this is the challenge we face. That's reality. How we face it is still up to us. There is nothing inevitable. I am never a fatalist, but I do think the challenges we face are significant, even if terrorism for the moment is not the principal challenge that we do face.
Thank you very much, Dr. Haass, for your very, would say, wise and candid tour d'horizon. Before opening the floor, I wouldn't be a good moderator if I wouldn't avail myself of the privilege of making the first comment as a typical good moderator. Sir, you ended your presentation with two big ideas: global issues and great power rivalry. Without denying a realistic approach, and I consider myself to be a realistic, but my question is there any possibility, looking into the future, that great power rivalry will not be the only organizing principle in global matters? Because I think that otherwise it's going to be very difficult to tackle global issues. Somehow, can we start thinking in going beyond a Westphalian approach?
Look, you ask a profound question. It's one I talk about a lot, and I've been thinking about a lot, and I write about. And what I try to tell people is just say the United States is successful in managing the challenges posed by Russia and China. Just say we keep these rivalries in check. We don't have wars. We don't have major problems of the sort that bedeviled the first half of the 20th century and much of previous history. Even if we succeed there, we could still fail in foreign policy if the gap between global challenges and our collective responses stays large or gets worse, gets larger. And so we have to adjust our foreign policy to deal with both sets of challenges. I don't think we have the luxury of choosing. We cannot only focus on global issues, as important as climate change is or pandemics are or what have you. And we certainly, though, can't focus just, say, on how to deal with the rising China. Because we could succeed there and still fail when it comes to looking after our national security. And I think that's the lesson, if you think about it, of the last couple of years. Look at all the, whatever the official numbers, the real numbers around the world are what? 15 million or more people have died from COVID. If one takes all the official deaths and adds to them the so-called excess deaths that are otherwise cannot be accounted for. The cost of climate change is already large and growing, and the potential threat to health and the success of certain countries is going to be large. So we know these have enormous costs. So essentially, we need a foreign policy that allows us to deal with the traditional problems posed by great power rivalry, but does so in a way that does not rule out the willingness and ability of these same powers, for whatever differences they will always have, to still cooperate on various global challenges, like climate, like proliferation, like health, what have you. That's the foreign policy challenge of this era. And I'm concerned because when you think about it, it places a tremendous demand upon, I guess, what you would call statecraft or diplomacy. It asks a lot of the people designing and implementing the foreign policy of the major powers and others. And I would just say, I'm not nearly as optimistic as I would like to be. And so I think you're right. I think we need a foreign policy and we need a diplomacy that deals, if you will, with the familiar traditional problems of muting great power rivalry at the same time that it promotes collective effort against global challenges, and doing those simultaneously. It's necessary, but far from easy.
Thank you very much, Dr. Haass. I think that we already have one matter for our mailbox between CARI and the Council on Foreign Affairs. And now I would like to give the floor to Francisco de Santibáñez, our Vice President. Francisco, you have the floor. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Ricardo. First of all, I want to thank President Haass not only for tonight's presentations, which was excellent, but also for having welcomed the members of CARI who in the last years have participated either in DC or New York of the Council of Councils annual meetings. And my question has to do to the evolution of US foreign policy towards Latin America. And two brief comments from the distance, no? It seems a couple of important changes. The first has to do with the American presidents facing more restrictions in foreign policy, for instance, to sign free trade agreements. No? Remember, 20 years ago, we were discussing about free trade of Americas. It seems now that neither Trump or Biden can do that because of popular opposition. No? And the second comment has to do with, seems to me that's a division between Central America and South America from the US perspective, that Central America has become almost a domestic issue because of migration. No? That's actually hurting the Biden administration right now, has become an important matter. Well, from South America, at least the perception I have and many have is that China has become a major issue. No? There is an increasing rivalry between the US and China. China is one of our main markets, it's a source of investment, but we also share more values with the US and many connections. No, there is still room for health issues, for collaboration in climate change, but it's increasingly obvious that the China question, the China issue is increasingly important from a US perspective. But of course, you are the one who knows. So those just two comments. Thanks.
China is, for many Americans, the principal challenge the United States faces. But I don't think anyone would say that Latin America is the principal or even one of the principal venues of that challenge. People are much more concerned about economic competition, obviously concerned about Taiwan, South China Sea, really what you might call more geopolitical competition. I think there is some concern about what China is doing with the Belt and Road, with investments. And I would say, quite honestly, if we don't like it, we should compete. There's no way to stop China from doing those things, so we have to provide alternatives. Whether in some cases it's foreign aid, whether in some cases it's investment, whether in some cases it's technology, you name it, which brings me to your first point. We handicap ourselves without having a trade policy. And it's, to me, it's a major, well, you all play football. In English, the phrase would be own goal. By not having a trade policy, we impose a strategic and economic cost on ourselves. We deny ourselves one of the principal instruments of foreign policy that would be good for us and would be good for people and countries in your part of the world. I'm frustrated by this. I'm very frustrated the United States has not joined what was the TPP, now is the CPTPP. I no longer hear people talking about initiatives for the Americas. I no longer hear creative ideas about what to do with the WTO. So it's very frustrating. And what makes it extra frustrating is that opinion polls show actually a majority of Americans support free trade in principle. The problem is a very intense minority opposes it. And at the moment, neither political party, neither Democrats nor Republicans, are willing to take any political risk or even take the time to explain why trade is in the interest of the United States. Very frustrating to me. And I find it ironic that people talk about how tough they are on China, but we're not willing to join the CPTPP, or they talk about how much we care about climate change, but they're not willing to impose cross-border carbon taxes on goods made with coal. There's a tremendous inconsistency here. So I actually, and people often say, it's very funny, people always say in the United States, we need bipartisanship. Well, we have bipartisanship on trade, but it's misguided bipartisanship. This is one area I don't want to see bipartisanship this way, but we're stuck with it for the time being. And I think everybody loses. I think we lose. I think, in this case, countries in the Americas lose. And I don't know what to say. I'm as frustrated as I expect. You are. I'd say one other thing. When Latin America has not gotten much attention, foreign policy in general doesn't get much attention. I think I am a little bit worried that when Latin America is discussed, it's mainly in a negative sense, dealing with immigration and the southern border. And then the question is, what we do about it? And I think it's a major lost opportunity for the United States. And I also think it's just incredibly short-sighted. But it's at least for the short term, it's going to be hard to change that, because again, there's so much emphasis on things domestic, or there's emphasis on China or Russia, or emphasis on Iran or North Korea, or emphasis on climate change. These are all important issues. But at the moment, Latin America, certainly South America, are not getting a lot of policymaker attention, which suggests to me that most of the initiatives will probably have to come from your country and other countries. And the question is, are there things you can do together without us, or are there things you can do together and then come to us, and maybe we can be persuaded to work with you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I will give the floor to Carola Ramón Berjano, member of the Executive Council in CARI, and she has the most sensitive role at CARI. She's the treasurer. Carola.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for your reflections. It's good to see you again. I believe last time we met in person was in Korea. It seems like a very long time ago now. I have a couple of comments. I actually wanted to make an initial comment, and I changed it as you kept responding to Francisco's comment. So it's a mixed comments I'm going to make now. Basically, I was wondering what's the sort of scope that smaller, less developed countries have in terms of the shaping their own foreign policies, maneuvering, negotiating, both in multilateral as well as bilateral arenas. You mentioned the great power rivalry while dealing with global challenges, and I think it's fair to say that while this big rivalry is going on, the smaller countries have less scope to influence the negotiation or the outcome. So the issues and interests of less developed countries become a bit more faded, and what becomes more relevant is this big power struggle. That's on the multilateral arena, but in the bilateral one, I was wondering, you mentioned these strategic distractions, the time and energy from policymakers while looking at other things. So I was wondering, while what happened in these 20 years while the US was more concerned on other issues and other regions, and you mentioned is that there's more concern on the domestic policies nowadays and global issues. So I was wondering, while this was happening, China increased the power, gained a lot more space in international arena, and particularly in Latin American region. We've been discussing in Argentina and the region how to keep a healthy balance between the two great powers, but also it's becoming increasingly more difficult to keep a healthy balance between one country that seems to have a very, very clear strategy of engagement with the region. You mentioned, for instance, Belt and Road, and the other big power that doesn't seem to be very clear, the engagement with the region. So so I'm turning it around. How can we keep this healthy balance if one of the big powers doesn't seem as engaged as the other one? And therefore, it's an unbalanced balance that we have to find. If that sort of makes sense, putting it that way. That's basically my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Carola. Good to see you again. I'd say a couple of things. What you raise is a really interesting question about what is the role or scope for smaller, the less wealthy countries on the world scene. It's very hard for individual small countries to do a lot simply because they're small. Then I would say find ways to come together with others who are like-minded, but not as a kind of group of 77 or the old ways of bashing the United States or what have you, but more to promote a positive agenda. There's nothing stopping small Argentina and other governments from coming together globally to deal with issues like reform of the World Health Organization. Good ideas there, or good ideas for how do we manage cyberspace. Or we're going to finish in Glasgow in a couple of days with climate. At best, it will be the most limited of successes. And that's a euphemism for it. It's going to be at least a partial, if not more than partial, failure. What could happen there? So there's nothing preventing smaller countries or medium-sized countries, the Canadas, the Argentinas, and any number of others, from being intellectual and diplomatic centers of innovation. No one's stopping you. Good ideas can come from anywhere. You can join with others and present them. I think that we need them. So I would say that. Certainly it makes sense regionally. Look, the principal regional organization in your part of the world is, how would I put it, has not been an overwhelming success over the decades. So the issue is how do you come up with, again, more ad hoc or selective arrangements that would promote creative agendas, dealing with all aspects from trade to investment to climate to migration, you name it, in your part of the world. I don't think, I come from the United States, so obviously I've had certain advantages, you might say, as a diplomat. But if I did come from a smaller country, I would essentially, I would try to make up for the lack of resources with creativity, and to put ideas out there that I thought could change the conversation. The question of distractions is, look, I think the United States, two things. One is, when I look at the last 20 or 30 years, and I compare them to the years after World War II, we've done nothing close to as creative. Look what happened after World War II. the creation of the entire United Nations system, the World Bank, the IMF, the general agreement on tariffs and trade. You had the alliance system. It was an extraordinary moment of statecraft. It's hard to say that we've done as well over the last 30 years. Let me just put it that way. We haven't. And the United States, while China was building up, I think in many cases we have not done enough either domestically or internationally to compete. Now we're finally trying to do more things, in particular in the Asia Pacific. And in Malaya, a few weeks ago, you had this new arrangement, AUKUS. We see new life being breathed into the so-called Quad and so forth. But we should have been doing more in what's now called the Indo-Pacific for years. We should have been doing more than we were. You didn't need to be a genius to figure out that this part of the world was where most of the people are, most of the wealth was, and would become increasingly a competitive venue as China, in particular, got stronger. So the United States could and should have been, I think, much more active in this part of the world. Your last point about it's sobering for me to hear you say that you basically you've got the China that's very present and the United States that's more absent than present. That's sobering, and I'm hoping that will gradually change. But again, I think the best thing you could do is, if you're uncomfortable with that, and if I were in your shoes, if I may say that, in sus zapatos, I would not want China to be dominant. I would not want China to be the dominant external power. And I would go to the United States with ideas for what you wanted it to do. And in particular, right now, for better and for worse, the most powerful domestic political force, or one of the most powerful domestic political forces in American foreign policy, is concerned about China. So if there are things that could be done that would usefully position the United States so we could better compete for influence with China, you actually might have some people who don't care a whole lot about Latin America, but might be incentivized to do something for that reason. So again, I think it probably argues for taking more initiatives, for putting more things on our agenda, just because when we're getting up in the morning, our first thought is not to look to South America. Indeed, whenever we do look south, it's more to look at the border or to Central America rather than to South America. But we're mainly looking, if you will, how do we deal with problems rather than how do we take advantage of possibilities and opportunities. But I think we're going to need your help there.
Thank you very much. Now I would like to read a question from Diogo Aguilar, a former ambassador to the United States and China. The question is the following: from 1 to 5, what is the place of 5G among the list of conflicts between USA and China?
I don't see it so much as a conflict that China has come out with 5G for various economic and strategic reasons, which are, I think, more valid than not. We do not want to become dependent on a Chinese-controlled infrastructure. The problem is, for a long time, we have not had an alternative. So there's an American expression, I don't know how well it translates in Spanish, but you can't beat something with nothing. If you don't like something, you've got to have a viable alternative. And to me, the lesson to be drawn from the 5G experience is, if we do not want China providing, if you will, the digital infrastructure in the 21st century, we have to produce and provide an alternative, something as good or better. And we obviously have the capability to do it. The question is whether we're sufficiently organized and so forth. So I don't see it. That to me is simply the lesson to be drawn. I think it's part of a larger issue, which is, again, it's not so much conflict, but it's friction, which is, how do we manage the technology dimension of the U.S.-China relationship or rivalry. We do not want certain technologies to go to China. We do not want China to have access to certain technologies. We do not want to be dependent on certain Chinese technologies or systems. On the other hand, we have a major interest in continuing certain forms of U.S.-Chinese trade and investment. So the word is not, I don't like the word decoupling. To me, the question is, how do we manage selectively certain technology issues within an overall relationship, and then how do we compete that? And increasingly, we're putting resources into that. So again, I don't see this as an area of conflict. I see this as an area of some friction, but basically competition. And it's really a question of whether we are prepared to do what we have to compete successfully. And I hope we are.
Thank you very much. And now I think we have time for one more question. And I'm sorry for all those who have handled that many questions. So I will give the floor now to Juan Bataleme. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Haass. It's a pleasure to see you again. Unfortunately, I'm not able to start my video right now because of this command system. In one of your last articles, you put emphasis on what matters in foreign policy is not what you can accomplish, but what you can to avoid. In that sense, I would like to ask you if the situation like happened with France in the alliance with Australia and United Kingdom in the Indo-Pacific should be one thing to avoid in the near future. And what other things you think that the U.S. foreign policy you should avoid?
Thank you. Well, absolutely. I mean, President Biden himself just a few days ago, when he met with President Macron of France, essentially apologized and said what we did was clumsy. And it was. And it just unnecessarily damaged the relationship. If the United States thought it was better to provide U.S. nuclear submarines to Australia rather than French diesel submarines, it should have gone to France. And I thought we should have looked for other ways to help France's defense exports. And I saw no reason why France should not be invited into this new grouping. So I thought this was, again, the president used the word clumsy. That's probably a generous word, but it should never have happened. Look, in foreign policy, what's important is both what the policy is and then how it's implemented or executed. So when it came to Afghanistan, which is what I was writing about, I think there's two separate debates. There was the debate about whether we should have stayed or left Afghanistan. I believe we should have stayed. Others, obviously, including the president, believe we were right to leave. But that was one conversation. The second conversation was how we went about it and whether it could have been managed. And I think most people would say that even those who thought it was right to leave, unlike me, thought that it should have been managed better. So my own view from my own time in government is that one has to think just as hard about how we do things as what we do. And that to me is the lesson of the mishandling of the submarine issue with France. I actually agreed with the decision. I just disagreed with how it was carried out, the lack of transparent consultations with a close ally. France will get over it. The United States, the U.S.-French relationship will continue on into the future, but it left a bad taste in people's mouths, and it was avoidable. It never should have happened, and I'm hoping that in the future, whatever the policies that are decided on, that they are executed with greater professionalism.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Haass. I think that we came to the end. I'm not planning to wrap up this conversation because I hope that we will continue to it into the future. But just before giving the floor again to José Octavio Bordón, to quote from your last article in Foreign Affairs, I think that we are looking towards being again present at the creation. Thank you very much, and José Octavio Bordón.
Thank you, Ricardo. Mr. President, dear Richard Haass, first of all, our recognition, congratulations for your words and for the dialogue, the open dialogue that you offer us. Secondly, you were talking today and in various occasions that we have global challenge, but not necessarily we have global answers. And it's one of the great objectives, the great challenge that we are having today. At the same time, I was remember that in 1992, during my time at Georgetown University at the Woodrow Wilson Center, I wrote a paper that the title was 1992, The Wall Fault in Both Sides. Obviously, I was in discussion with my colleagues of the Inter-American Dialogue, Francis Fukuyama, and our ideas in that moment. I need to recognize that I didn't imagine the situation and the challenge that we are having today. But I remember also in my time as ambassador to the United States, some of our conversations at the council about the risk of high polarization inside the countries. Unfortunately, we continue. At the same time, we have today great challenge to our democracies, and some of them are on risk today. And the problem, we believe, is that we are trying to answer new challenge with the traditional answers that we have and we had in the past. For this reason, I think the dialogue today was very important for all of us to find new relation, new global dialogue, and the renovation of not only of our democracies, but at the same time maintaining our values, our democracy representative, our democratic Republicans, our Republicans democratics, but at the same time to change and to renovate the international arena and the multilateralism. For this reason, we need to continue our conversation. I want out of the program, first of all, you know, the CARI, we are very, very proud to share, to be partners in many issues with the Council of Foreign Relations. And you know, CARI is a democratic institution with dialogue and consensus. For the reason, I have two requests. First, some words to you for our former president, Rodriguez Javarini, and finally, your final words, please.
Richard, a great pleasure to see you again. Really, terrific presentation as usual, and particularly my best regard for all your team, your people that's working with you permanently, and particular for your lovely daughter. I see you soon. Bye.
Thanks, my friend. I appreciate it. Thanks for all of you for for your very generous words. And I just wanted to pick up on one thing Jose Octavio said, and I'll stop, which is this is an important time. We're dealing with all these international challenges. But you're right. We're also dealing with these very powerful challenges to the functioning and effectiveness of our respective democracies. For what it's worth, my next book is about American democracy. I actually think the biggest challenge facing the United States is not China or Russia or terrorism or even climate change. I think the greatest challenge facing us is us and how well we can manage our internal challenges. So I think for our institutions, we need to expand our agendas in some way, because we'll only be effective in the world if we're united and stable at home. So I think our agenda is getting bigger rather than smaller. So I look forward to future conversations and future collaborations. And like I said, I look forward to seeing you in person, either when I next get to visit or at some future Council of Councils meeting. So thank you very much for asking me to join you today.
Thank you, Mr. President. We hope to see you face to face as soon as possible.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Be safe, everybody. Be well.